I can put something your way. Yeah.
Well, it's time for us to get started. Hey, Raymond, will you say a prayer for us?
Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for letting us come here safely tonight to study your word. We ask that you would please be with us during this time of study. Please help us to study carefully and learn the things that you're trying to teach us. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. Where's your kids?
There was a ball game and they're supposed to leave Fred Road at 6:30 to get it set.
Oh. Traffic. Yep. All right, we're in 2 Samuel chapter 13. We're going to finish that up. We're going to do 14, 15, and 16. We are going to do 14, 15. Don't laugh at me.
No, we're not laughing. We'll just say, well, believe it when we see it.
Yeah, believe it when you see it, right?
From Missouri.
Okay, Tamar has been abused by Amnon, of course, and then basically just discarded. I was reading something interesting today about that. When he called his servant to have her thrust out, if you look at your Bibles, it'll say, put this woman out, and woman should be in italics because it's applied. And the indication there from the original Hebrew is he says, put this creature out, and bolt the door behind her. He is definitely a vile individual for what he does to her. Okay, so she is put out, and then Absalom asked Tamar about Amnon, and it says right here, it says in verse 20, and Absalom, her brother, said to her, has Amnon, your brother, been with you? But now hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this thing to heart. So Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. Okay? Another interesting thing, when Absalom asked, has Amnon been with you? Of course, he's putting that in a very delicate way for her sake, but he uses the diminutive form of Amnon. It's like he's making nothing of him, which indicates to us that Absalom didn't have a very high regard for Amnon to begin with. Okay? It's like, did this little jerk do something? This creep do something? And so now he tells Tamar, why would he tell Tamar to keep quiet about what had happened? Why would he tell her, okay, just be quiet about it? There in verse 20, he says, but now hold your peace, my sister.
I think it means he's planning to take care of it.
Okay. Number one, he may have planned to take care of it. Okay, let's just kind of keep this on the down low here. Right. How long did it take him to take care of it? 2 years. Okay, 2 years he's plotting this. All right. Any other reasons why he may have told her to keep quiet about what had happened?
Maybe for her reputation.
Okay, for her benefit, her reputation, also to avoid possibly a family scandal. I mean, he says he is your brother, okay? And the idea is like, this doesn't need to get out. This doesn't need to go around, okay? And going along with what Barry said at first, he's plotting his revenge, maybe to give Amnon a sense of false security. I mean, certainly after 2 years, Amnon's got to be thinking, hey, I got away with it. Nobody's going to do anything to me. But Absalom is not forgetful. So it says that Tamar remains desolate in Absalom's house. What does that mean? She remains desolate. Anybody have any idea?
I think it means she's not married, she's single.
Yeah. The indication is she never marries, she never has children. If you looked at Isaiah 54 at verse 1, in the prophecy about Israel, Isaiah is talking about she who is desolate has more children than the married, and probably a reference to Sarah and Hagar, and the idea, no. She who is desolate has more children than she who has a husband, I think is how that's quoted. And it's talking about the idea of someone who doesn't have children or perhaps isn't married. And the idea of her staying in his house, it's very good indication that Absalom provides for her for the rest of her life. Yes, Pat?
And just because it says what Absalom says to her does not mean that it was good advice.
Oh yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean it's good advice.
That's what society tells people.
Yeah.
That have been abused sexually.
Yeah.
Where there's been incest. Oh, be quiet. You know.
Right.
You don't want to bring shame on him.
Oh yeah.
Oh, you know, you'll embarrass your father.
Right.
You know, that kind of thing. And that's evil.
Yeah.
And that's why women are standing up.
Yeah.
And speaking out and saying, he did this.
Yeah. Oh, I agree completely. I used to date a girl when I was in high school, and later on in our relationship, I found out that her stepfather sexually started assaulting her when she was 12 and abusing her. And her mother found out about it, but her mother just wanted to not say anything and didn't want her to say anything or anything because she didn't want to lose her husband, right? And so things like that happen all the time. So to avoid a family scandal, to not let it get out was not necessarily fair to Tamar, right? David himself hears about it. And what was his reaction? Angry. And that word angry means he burned with anger. Okay, he was incensed. But what did David do about it? Nothing. Yeah, he didn't do anything. So what does that tell you about David and Tamar? Right? Tamar is his daughter. Now, of course, women had a different place in society, you know, back then. There's still parts of the world that women have a very lowly place, and that's because they've been pushed down by the men in those societies. But I still can't understand that a father's love for his daughter would allow that, okay? But who is Amnon? His firstborn son, okay? Amnon was the one that was going to receive the throne at this point. So Tamar is not treated right by anybody. I'm sure Absalom, you know, providing for her, most likely for the rest of her life, or the rest of his life, and then taking her in was probably his act of mercy. So David hears of these things. He burns with anger. He does nothing. The Septuagint says, right there after verse 21, says, but when King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. Okay? The Septuagint has for us, but he did not vex the spirit of his son Amnon, for he loved him since he was his firstborn. And there's some debate as to whether or not that belongs in the text or not. And I think it's slightly on the side of the majority that thinks it does belong in the text. That would seem to be the reason, even without it there in the text. But could it have possibly been he didn't do anything to Amnon because of his guilt over what he himself had done with Bathsheba? I mean, think about that. The sin with Bathsheba is going to plague him for the rest of his life. How might things have gone if he had held Amnon accountable? You know, if he had held Amnon accountable, if he would have held Amnon accountable, would Absalom have revolted against him? You know, there's a good chance that he wouldn't have, but we don't know. But the idea is David is fumbling here. He's fumbling as a father. He was not a very good father. In some ways, he wasn't a very good husband. But he is still described as a man after God's own heart. Some point out this parallels the incident in Genesis 34 with Jacob and Dinah. Dinah, Jacob's daughter. What happened with her? What happened with Dinah?
Men of Shechem, one of the men of Shechem wanted her, so they
Yeah,
made a deal and killed them all.
right. I think it was the son of the king of Shechem basically raped Dinah. Okay? And so Jacob let that go. He actually made a deal with them that they could, it says he loved her. Okay? And I think it might be an assumption that he raped her, but he lied with her without being married to her. And then Jacob said, well, if all of your men will submit to circumcision, then we'll approve of this marriage. But then what happened after that?
Actually, there's actually his son that came up with that nice little gesture.
Subterfuge, right?
Yeah, it was Levi and Simeon.
Yeah.
Sure, tell you what, you go get circumcised and we'll join with you. And in the midst of all their pain, they went out and slaughtered them all.
Yeah, and the third day, right, when the pain was supposedly pretty bad, they went in and they killed them all. So just like Absalom kills Amnon, Simeon and Levi go in and they kill all the men of Shechem. And it causes problems for Jacob. Jacob complains, says, you have made me a stench or a stink to all the people around here. Now it will come to pass that people will be against me. So history's kind of repeating itself here. Absalom, verse 22 tells us, he continues as nothing had happened. It says he spoke neither good nor bad to him. Okay, for 2 full years. He doesn't say anything. This may mean that he didn't speak to him at all for 2 years. It says for he hated him. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that he treated him like nothing had happened. He may have just said nothing to him at all, cut him off for a couple of years. But then that leads us into Absalom's revenge in verses 23 through 33. What is Absalom inviting David to attend? Absalom goes into David and he invites him. It says, it came to pass in verse 23, after 2 full years, that Absalom had sheep shearers in Baal-hazor, which is near Ephraim. So Absalom invited all the king's sons. Then Absalom came to the king and said, kindly note, your servant has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant. But the king said to Absalom, no, my son, let us not all go now, lest we be burdened to you. Then he urged him, but he would not go, and he blessed him. Then Absalom said, if not, please let my brother Amnon go with us. And the king said to him, why should he go with you? But Absalom urged him so that he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. What's Amnon inviting him to?
Absalom's inviting him to come have a party because we're shearing the sheep.
Yeah, shearing the sheep was always an event, okay? They used that as an event to have feasts and parties, and it was a big deal. Just like at the harvest, a lot of times when they had finished with the threshing. And so, come on down here. David says, no, lest we be a burden to you. The idea here is David may be saying, look, you can't afford this. My whole household, all my servants, all my sons, says, no, we won't go down now. And then David gets kind of suspicious when he says, well, how about just Amnon comes? Okay? It's been 2 years, but still David says, well, why should Amnon come? And then it seems like Absalom kind of recovers a little bit. He keeps asking, and David relents, and he says, yeah, just take all the boys, right? Take all my son. And so they go down there, and what has Absalom planned? Yeah, kill him, an ambush, right? He tells his men, he says, look, don't be afraid, be strong, be valiant, I have commanded you. And so he's basically saying, you're just following orders. I'm the one who's going to take responsibility for this. And so you watch him. When he starts feeling good from drinking the wine, then I give the word, you attack, and you kill him. So that's exactly what happens. So when this happens, it says all of David's other sons get on their mules and they flee. Why are they running away? Why don't they stand up to defend Amnon? What's going on here?
I think they think Absalom's making a play for the throne, right?
Yeah.
Taking out the firstborn, who else is he going to take out to make sure he's on top?
Yeah, I mean, this would very easily go through their mind. Amnon's the firstborn. He's next in line. You got Absalom, who comes after him in the line of succession. He has Amnon killed, as a very common thing, to kill every heir to the throne so that you could take it for yourself. And so they get up and run away. And then, of course, it comes to David's ears that all of his sons have been killed. And it's kind of interesting that the same individual who told Amnon how to go ahead and trick Tamar into coming to him is the one that advises David and says, oh no, not all your sons are killed, just Amnon is killed. And in fact, he notices it. He says in verse 32, then Jonadab, the son of Shimeah, David's brother, answered and said, let not my lord suppose that they have killed all the young men, the king's sons, for only Amnon is dead. For by the command of Absalom, this has been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. So this Jonadab, a crafty man, a sly man, he is aware somehow of what's going on. And so therefore, let not my lord the king take the thing to heart to think that all the king's sons are dead, for only Amnon is dead. Okay. And then after this, of course, Absalom flees. And where does he go? Yeah, he goes to his grandfather. And I think some people miss that. He goes to his maternal grandfather in Geshur. Chapter 3 at verse 3 gives his lineage and tells us that the place he fled to basically was his grandfather's house. And so it says in verse 39, well, actually, verse 38. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there 3 years. And King David longed to go to Absalom, for he had been comforted concerning Amnon because he was dead. Verse 39 is problematic for translators in the Hebrew. It can be translated to say, David had longed to go to Absalom to punish him. But after 3 years, he is now relenting in that because he's been comforted over the death of Amnon, his son. Okay. Others translate it the way it reads here in the New King James. David longed to go to Absalom for reconciliation, basically, for he had been comforted concerning Amnon because he was dead. So I kind of have a tendency to think that David is wanting to go to Absalom, because what's David's reaction when Absalom dies? He says, Absalom, he mourns over him. Absalom, Absalom, my son. When he eventually dies, Joab kills him. And so I kind of think, David's got some mixed up feelings here. But after 3 years, he wants to go see him. Okay? And then in verse 1 of chapter 14, so Joab, the son of Zeruiah, perceived the king's heart was concerned about Absalom. Again, that can be taken one of two ways. Is he concerned that Absalom is going to revolt against him? Is he concerned that he hasn't executed judgment against Absalom? Or is he concerned that he's lost his son Absalom and he wants to be reunited with him? So what does Joab do in chapter 14 here?
He tells his lady to go lie for him.
He tells what?
He tells the lady to go
tell him a fib?
Yeah.
All right. He searches out for a wise woman of Tekoa. And he wants her to go to David in order to persuade him to bring Absalom back home. Apparently, Absalom has been banished. He not only fled, but he's been banished. And Joab apparently sees that David is distraught over this. He doesn't think it's good for the kingdom. There may be some other reasons there as well. But how does the woman go about persuading David to bring Absalom back? Are there any similarities between the wise woman of Tekoa and Nathan the prophet?
Just lay out exactly what happened, but with different names. And David won't see it coming. Right at the end.
Yeah, we're talking about you. Why don't you bring Absalom back? So, I guess, David's a sucker for a good story, right? And so he said, yeah. And he said, well, then how come you're not bringing your son back? And so this is what she does. Now, this is all engineered by Joab. So there's some possible reasons why Joab may have wanted David to bring Absalom home. One, which we've already talked about, out of concern for David. Okay? Anybody think of any other reason? Possibly to ensure the royal line. Okay, Absalom's next in line. Of course, David had other sons, but what happens if Absalom's alive and the third guy in line takes the throne? Now you're risking civil war. You're risking a lot. And Joab was pretty politically astute. Okay, he wasn't a dummy. We talk about him being a violent man, and he certainly was. He was a ruthless individual, but he knew his politics. So there's a possibility. A third possibility would not be to ensure that Absalom received the throne after David's death, but to keep an eye on Absalom. Okay? Because if he's away and he's got a legitimate claim to the throne, there's no real idea of what Absalom's actually up to or what he's doing. So bringing him back might be a good way to keep an eye on him and a good strategy. Okay? So he comes back, but David refuses to let him see him. So why did David refuse to let Absalom see him? If David is so concerned about Absalom, he finally relents, he gets him to come back, yet he says, but he can't see my face. Why do you suppose? Couple possible reasons. One, possibly punishment or anger still. He's just not over it, right? And I don't imagine how you would ever get over that. Okay? Another possible reason is to indicate that he was no longer the heir. Because if he can't see David, he's no longer a part of the royal court. He's no longer a part of David's retinue, if you will. He is an outcast here. And so he stays in Jerusalem without being able to see David for 2 years. And then he finally gets upset about it. Okay? And I think this is fairly a humorous story. Absalom is a very direct individual. In verses 25 through 33, we have a physical description of Absalom. In actually 25 through 26. Why is the writer of this book giving us such a description of Absalom? What is his description of Absalom?
Good-looking man.
There's not a blemish in him from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. This guy is perfect. Okay? His hair, he's got that long, beautiful, flowing hair that he cuts once a year, and it weighs between 3 and 4 pounds every time he has it cut. So we're talking about the idea of thick, lustrous, long hair. Okay? Why would he be making a reference to his hair here?
Foreshadowing.
Well, foreshadowing, right? It's going to end up getting him killed because he gets hung up in the terebinth tree by the hair. Okay? The hair will be the cause of his death. By the way, what did Absalom name his daughter? Tamar. Okay? And I thought that's kind of interesting. It might indicate, again, the closeness that Absalom had to his sister there. So he names his daughter Tamar. How long was he in Jerusalem without being able to see David? 2 years or being allowed at court. So what's Absalom's claim in verse 32? He's upset. He finally gets Joab's attention. By the way, how does he get Joab's attention? He calls for him twice and Joab won't come. So what does he do? He sets his barley field on fire. That gets Joab's attention. He comes down and says, "What are you doing?" He says, "What are you doing?" And then in verse 32, Absalom said, Joab, "Look, I sent to you saying, 'Come here, so that I may send you to the king to say, why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to be there still. Now therefore, let me see the king's face. But if there is any iniquity in me, let him execute me.'" So what does Absalom think of his murder of Amnon? Perfectly legitimate and justified. And you can see why he could make that argument. Because would not he be, according to the law of Moses, the avenger of blood? You know, to kill Amnon. Amnon certainly hadn't fled to a city of refuge. Right? David is not executing judgment on Amnon because he's his firstborn. David loves him, you know, tremendously. And Absalom here, he says, "Look what he's done to my sister." And he feels justified. If there's any iniquity in me, let him execute me. And David's not about to do that. I don't think David would be able to find any iniquity in him.
I'm wondering if Amnon did go to a city of refuge, and that's why he was saying he waited 2 years to kind of make it seem like everything's okay, and then he asked everyone to come to his place where the sheep were being shorn.
Right.
Sheared.
Yeah. Shorn, sheared. I think it's shorn. But the idea here is when you fled to the city of refuge, if you are found without the walls of the city of refuge, the avenger of blood has every right to kill you, unless what has taken place? The death of the high priest. I think it was the death of the high priest that was necessary for you to be able to come out of the city of refuge. It also might be the year of Jubilee. Remember, every 50 years, all debts were forgiven. But I think when it came to a murder and the cities of refuge, I think it was the death of the high priest. All right. So here's Absalom. He finally gets to go see David. Verse 33, so Joab went to the king and told him, and when he had called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and then the king kissed Absalom. And that's the idea of a sign of, okay, you're back in the family, kind of like the Godfather, right? You're back in the family, you're back in the court, and it's all good. So then that brings us to chapter 15. And what happens in chapter 15? What does Absalom spend the next 4 years doing? Politicking. Right? There you go. He spends the next 4 years currying favor with all the men of Israel. Okay? The first thing it says that he does is he gets him some chariots. And this is the first instance where you have any Israelite king, he's going to proclaim himself as king, or royalty riding in a chariot. Chariots have always been the battle tanks of the enemy. He gets himself a chariot. It says chariots plural in the New King James, and 50 men to go before him. So here he is. He's allowed back at court. It seems like in no time he's putting on airs. Okay? He gets his chariot. He's got 50 men to go before him. After all, if he's accepted back at court, he is the crown prince, right? He's the heir apparent. And so he is promoting that image of himself. That's the first thing he does. What's the second thing he does? Yeah, he becomes a wayside lawyer, right? A hedge lawyer. And so he stands outside the gate early in the morning. When anybody is coming up to the king to make a petition, he intercepts them. And he's, like Gay said, he's doing a lot of politicking here. Let's read what it says. It says in verse 2, "Now Absalom would rise early and stand beside the way to the gate. So it was, whenever anyone who had a lawsuit came to the king for a decision, that Absalom would call to him and say, 'What city are you from?'" So the first thing that Absalom is doing is he's establishing friendly terms with whoever. "Oh, where are you from?" Right? It's not just, okay, I need to know what city you're from. It's not some administrative question. It's like, "Where are you from?" And he would say, "Your servant's from such and such tribe of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your case is good and right, but there's no deputy of the king to hear you." So he's kind of slandering the administration here. Moreover, Absalom would say, "Oh, that I were made judge in the land, and everyone who has any suit or cause would come to me, then I would give him justice." He's not saying, "Oh, if I were king." He's saying, "Oh, if I were made judge, if I were given the position where I could take care of this responsibility that is the king's, right, then everybody would have justice. I would give him justice." And so it was, whenever anyone came near to bow down to him, that he would put out his hand and take him and kiss him. Okay? The idea is he's not even going to let them bow down. He's going to put out his hand. He's going to stop that. He's going to take them. He's going to embrace them. He's going to kiss them. He's going to show this great familiarity that you're not going to find in any court of law, and you're not going to find in the king's council chambers. Absalom is making himself a man of the people. He's politicking, and he's doing it really heavy. And so, in verse 6, "In this manner Absalom acted toward all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel." Now you think about that. Who did he steal those hearts from? He didn't steal those hearts from Saul. He stole those hearts from David. And what did Israel think of David? Israel, for the longest time, thought David can do no wrong. David is just incredible. Yet Absalom comes along. Now, there's the possibility here that David is actually himself in a state of decline. His monarchy is in a state of decline. He's getting older himself, okay? He doesn't seem to be going out to battle like he used to. He's become a king, sitting on a throne, okay? Absalom, young, virile, good-looking, compassionate, tender with the people. And so verse 7 says, "And it came to pass after," and some of your versions will say 40 years, "that Absalom said to the king, 'Please let me go to Hebron and pay the vow which I vowed to the Lord.'" That's most likely 4 years, not 40 years. Okay? David only reigned for 40 years. So this is considered like a scribal error. Okay? So here he is, and Absalom here, he's stealing the hearts of the men of Israel over a period of 4 years. And then he goes to the king and he says, "Hey, I made a vow to God that if I ever got to come back to Jerusalem, I would go to Hebron and pay a vow to him." And after all, Absalom was born at Hebron. There's a place of worship at Hebron. So this sounds innocent enough. But why might Absalom have wanted to go to Hebron? What's the significance of him going to Hebron?
Where David became king.
What?
Where David became king.
It's where David became king. It's where David was proclaimed king. It's a walled fortress. It's a walled city. Okay? If Absalom's going to go down there and he's going to be proclaimed king, he certainly would like to have a defensible position. Okay? And David ruled there for 7 years. Okay? Before he became king and he took Jerusalem. So Absalom goes down there. He's ostensibly going down there to sacrifice, but he sends spies throughout all the tribes of Israel because he's stolen everybody's heart. As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom reigns in Hebron. And then what's verse 11 say? Who went with him? 200 men from Jerusalem. But how did they go? They went innocently. Okay? They're going down with him. Think about this. Here's the son of the king, the crown prince. He's going down to Hebron to worship. Who were these 200 men? Were they the poor and lonely of Jerusalem? Or were they powerful men in Jerusalem? Were they men that were perhaps part of David's court? So they go down there innocently. They're not aware of what's going on. They're not aware of what Absalom's going to do. So Absalom potentially has 200 built-in hostages. Okay? He's been planning this for a long time. He's got spies. He's got people set up. Then in verse 12, it says, Then Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city, namely from Gilo, where he offered sacrifices. And the conspiracy grew strong, for the people with Absalom continually increased in number. Who is Ahithophel? He is one of David's counselors, but does anybody remember the family connection? And why he might have so readily left David and joined himself to Absalom? He is Bathsheba's grandfather. He's Bathsheba's grandfather. And so there may very well have been some resentment on his part for what he had done with Bathsheba and then done to Uriah. So he immediately goes over to Absalom. We've got a big, hairy, gnarly mess in this whole family and all these relationships. Isn't that what God said was going to happen? The sword will never depart from your house. And all of this started with David lusting over Bathsheba and then taking another man's wife and having him murdered, right? Can anybody give me one example of an adulterous relationship where everything turned out just fine? It doesn't happen that way. And so many people will try to rationalize it and defend it and say this was the right thing to do, and it's never the right thing to do. Okay? And we have just a huge example here. He's David's counselor, but he's Bathsheba's grandfather. Drop down to verses 31 through 34 in chapter 15. Someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Now it happened when David had come to the top of the mountain where he worshiped God, that there was Hushai the Archite coming to meet him with his robe torn and dust on his head. This is after David has fled from Jerusalem. Then David said to him, If you go on with me, then you will become a burden to me. So I get the idea that Hushai was probably an older individual. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, just as I have been your father's servant previously, so I will now also be your servant. Then you may defeat the counsel of Ahithophel for me. Okay? So this is just one instance of David, when he's on his way out of Jerusalem, he's making plans. You know, he's leaving. He's sparing the city a siege. He's sparing a lot of bloodshed here. He's leaving, but he's making plans for his return. And we're going to see that as we get down a little bit further in the chapter here. So David takes off. He's told of Absalom's treason. He flees Jerusalem. Look at verse 18 of chapter 15. It says, Then all his servants passed before him, and all the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and all the Gittites, 600 men who had followed him from Gath, passed before the king. Does anybody know who the Cherethites, Pelethites, and the Gittites are?
they're Philistines.
Okay? They're Philistines. And there's a good chance that the Pelethites and the Cherethites are Philistines as well. These are people of the Philistines who, when David was there, among them and going out and fighting battles, that joined themselves to David. And the Cherethites, the Pelethites, essentially become David's Praetorian Guard, right? They're his bodyguard. They're the ones that are right there in the palace, and they're the ones that ensure his safety. So they're loyal to him, and they go out with him. So all the servants go out. Then we read about somebody else in verses 19 through 22. And the king said to Ittai the Gittite, okay, he's a Philistine. He's from Gath. Why are you also going with us? Return and remain with the king, for you are a foreigner and also an exile from your own place. In fact, you came only yesterday. Should I make you wander up and down with us today, since I go I know not where? Return and take your brethren back. Mercy and truth be with you. So it was not uncommon to have individuals become exiled from their kingdom or their land or flee their land, and then they would find work as mercenaries for other kings. This is what David did when he was on the run from Saul. So now here's Ittai and his family. And David says, you just came yesterday, and now here I am being run out of town. Just go back and be with the king. And David's like, I'm not going to hold it over your head. I wouldn't blame you a bit. He realizes that Absalom's going to claim the throne. Listen to what Ittai says. In verse 21, and Ittai answered the king and said, as the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, surely in whatever place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, then there also your servant will be. So David said to Ittai, go and cross over. Then Ittai the Gittite and all his men and all the little ones who were with him crossed over. The thing about Ittai, he knows who the king is. He knows it's not Absalom. He knows that it's David. And so he stays loyal to David, and I think you're going to read about him in the list of David's honorable men and faithful men later on in the book of Chronicles. So there's Ittai. But then we also read about 4 others before we get to Hushai. And that's Zadok, Abiathar, Ahimaaz, and Jonathan. Okay? Ahimaaz is the son of Zadok. Zadok is the priest. Okay? And all the Levites are with him. Jonathan is the son of Abiathar. Does anybody remember who Abiathar is? He was the priest that escaped when Saul had Ahimelech and all the priests at Nob killed. And he brought the ephod to David. And he ministered as a priest to David all the time that David was on the run. Okay? So these 4 individuals come to David. It says here in verse 24, there was Zadok also, and all the Levites with him, bearing the ark of the covenant of God. And they set down the ark of God, and Abiathar went up until all the people had finished crossing over the city. Then the king said to Zadok, carry the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and show me both it and its habitation. But if he says, thus, I have no delight in you, here I am, let him do to me as seems good to him. So David is still resigned to doing God's will and submitting to God's will. I'm sure David struggled with the guilt of his situation for the rest of his life. Verse 27, the king also said to Zadok the priest, are you not a seer? Return to the city in peace, and your 2 sons with you, Ahimaaz your son, and Jonathan the son of Abiathar. See, I will wait in the plains of the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me. Therefore Zadok and Abiathar carried the ark of God back to Jerusalem, and they remained there. Then when Hushai comes up, down in verse 34, he says, if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, just as I have been your father's servant previously, so I will now also be your servant. Then you may defeat the counsel of Ahithophel for me, And do you not have Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, with you there? Therefore, it will be that whatever you hear from the king's house, you shall tell to Zadok and Abiathar, the priests. Indeed, they have there with them their own 2 sons, Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, and Jonathan, Abiathar's son. And by them you shall send me everything you hear. So Hushai, David's friend, went into the city, and Absalom came into Jerusalem. So David is leaving, but he's setting up a spy network. You know, he is leaving in place what he needs to eventually be able to return. That's his goal. His attitude is whatever God decides to do, that's what's going to happen. But his goal is to return to Jerusalem and overcome Absalom's uprising. So that was his intended purpose for those 5 men. All right, chapter 16. In chapter 16, what are the first 4 verses about?
Mephibosheth's son, Ziba, or servant.
Yeah.
Meeting David and giving him food and stuff, and then letting him know that Mephibosheth thinks he's going to be king again.
Yeah, you've got Ziba, and we first met him back in chapter 9, verses 7 through 13. David called Ziba, who is over all of Saul's land. He says, does Saul have any descendants that I can honor because of Jonathan, my friend? He says he has a son, Mephibosheth. So David calls Mephibosheth, and it says, from now on, you're going to eat at my table. Ziba, I want you to take care of all of his land for him. And Mephibosheth, in turn, has a son, and David takes care of them, you know, beautifully. But now, because of what Absalom's doing, Mephibosheth thinks, hey, I got a chance of being king here, right? We've got some disruption. We've got some turmoil. You talk about a treasonous heart. You know, after everything that David has done for him, David could have executed him. And I'm sure that's what Mephibosheth thought was going to happen. But David showed him this tremendous kindness. Right? And he ate at David's table, but he didn't need to because he had all the lands of Saul. And Ziba was taking care of those. He was self-sufficient. It wasn't charity on David's part. It was love for Jonathan on David's part. It was honor on David's part. Mephibosheth turns against that. Ziba meets David, and Ziba certainly knows this is Mephibosheth's mind, but Ziba is loyal to David. And so he meets him with saddled donkeys, 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, 100 summer fruits, and a skin of wine. David says, what's this? And he says, this is for you. And so the king said to Ziba in verse 4, here, all that belongs to Mephibosheth is yours. And Ziba said, I humbly bow before you, that I may find favor in your sight, O my lord, O king. Okay? That was not 5 minutes. All right.
On the first one.
All right. I just want you to know we made it into chapter 16. Okay, we made it into chapter 16. We'll finish that up next week, and we'll move on.
And we're going to sing number 406, Son of My Soul. Sing all 4 verses, and we'll probably keep the tempo up faster than we usually sing it. Just try and keep up. Son of my soul, thou Savior dear, it is not night if thou be near. Oh, may no earth-born cloud arise to hide thee from thy servant's eyes. When the soft dews of kindly sleep my wearied eyelids gently sleep, be my last thought how sweet to rest forever on my Savior's breast. Abide with me from morn till eve, for without thee I cannot live. Abide with me when night is nigh, for without thee I dare not die. Come near and bless us when we wake, ere through the world our way we take, till in the ocean of thy love we lose ourselves in heaven above.
Good to see everybody out for a period of Bible study, and hope that you'll make yourself available to come Sunday morning at 9 o'clock for a period of worship and more Bible study as well. So, have a few announcements to make. First of all, those who are out of town, Katie Mees is in Europe somewhere. Wiener is out of town cruising. And the Gators are at the Springdale Gospel Meeting, and that accounts for all their absences. There's going to be a singing in Rogers on Friday, April 22nd. The flyer is back there in the back, right above where Danny's sitting. And so make yourself available to that if you're able to be there. And the last announcement is pretty sad. Some of you guys may have seen the message about Tori and having her baby early. Tori Scott, Tori Mills, I guess now. Turner and Tori Mills. Their baby was born Monday morning at 4:42 a.m., weighed 1.25 pounds, and he's 17 weeks premature. And so that was early Monday morning. Since then, got notification, John said that there's brain bleed right now on the baby had the brain bleed, and the family is deciding what to do now. Keep him on ventilator. If they keep him alive, if he pulls through, most likely will have severe medical issues. So let's keep the Scott family, the Mills family in our prayers, and pray that God's will be done. Is there anything else that needs to be announced at this time? If not, we'll be dismissed with a word of prayer.
Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for letting us come here this evening to study your word and to be together. We ask you please be with us as we go back to our homes. Help us to live through the rest of this week in a way that's pleasing to you. We ask that you would please be with the ones who are away from us, who are mentioned as being away. Please bring them back safely to us. At this time, we're especially mindful of Tori and of the Scott family. We ask that you would please watch over them and keep them in your care. And in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.